and it's up on the screen for you. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lift up your hearts.
We lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right to give our thanks and praise.
It is right and a good and joyful thing, always and everywhere, to give thanks to you, Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth. You formed us in your image and breathed into us the breath of life. When we turned away and our love failed, your love remained steadfast. You delivered us from captivity and made a covenant to be our sovereign God and spoke to us through your prophets, who looked for that day when justice shall roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. When nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
Overwhelmed by the commercialism and the materialism of this season, and often it gets lost. And so our hope during this Advent is this is going to be truly a time of preparation, like it was in the historic church. There was a time when converts would use Advent much like they used Lent as a time to prepare for their baptisms. And so my hope for us is that this is a time of preparation. For all of our children who are in worship this morning, I have a box that I'd like you to take a look at. I don't know if you're like me, but if you're like me, when a box shows up at my door with my name on it, I still get really excited. Do you get excited when boxes come with your names on it? Well, today we are going to be preparing boxes of gifts that we are going to send to our young adults. And we are going to send these boxes that are going to be filled with fun things to our young adults, and we're going to do that as a reminder to them that God loves them, and that their church loves them and is thinking of them, and that this is meant to be a tangible and concrete reminder of that they are important. You know, we during Christmas, we are going to be remembering about that there were some people that when they came and met Jesus, they brought gifts. In fact, the story says they brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But the thing about those people who came and gave Jesus gifts, that was one of the ways that they demonstrated that they loved Him and that they were committed to Him. And when we exchange gifts on Christmas, that is also meant to be a way that we express our love to one another. So my hope is that you and your parents and all of those folks that are in worship today, after worship is over, will go across the commons area, enter the atrium, we'll pick up a box, we'll write a note of encouragement to our young adults, and you'll even see the name on it. This one's going to go to Emily Bialka that I grabbed. And then you'll then go throughout the whole fellowship hall and fill it with all of the treats and goodies and things that we're going to send to our young adults. And so I'm excited about that. One of the things that I very much appreciate about this church is that this is a church that honors people's journeys in the faith wherever they may be. In fact, our welcome statement says that you can come and explore where you are in your faith and you'll be encouraged. In fact, we understand that faith is a journey of trust and transformation where our beliefs are formed and reformed in Christian community. And the reason that's important to me is because my family of origin. The family I was raised in was made up of 5, when it comes to the faith, pretty interesting characters. We had an atheist who it just drives him nuts the way that many people in the Christian faith think. There was an agnostic who's not sure there's a God, but isn't sure there isn't a God. There is an evangelical, conservative Christian. And there's a skeptic who wants to believe, but belief just does not come very easy. And then there's me, the United Methodist pastor who serves a progressive Christian community, who's had this kind of life-changing experience of being kind of transformed from God's power and Spirit from above. And holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas can be really interesting. So here's the thing that I really find interesting is that for each person, there does not seem to be much of a correlation between their faith and their commitment to making our world more caring or more loving or more just. And this morning, I'd like to do a little bit of work with you about thinking about our Christian faith, especially with the text that we have today. So the first thing I'd like us to do is to explore, how do we think of doubt? Because this passage has something important to say to us about how does doubt function in our lives. As a people who are exploring our faith and are doing that work of processing our faith, informing it and reforming it, how does doubt function? And the very first thing I guess I'd like to encourage us to think about is the passage that Pastor Kelly read for us this morning comes in a context. Comes in the context of, it was a message that came to a Jewish family that was a part of a religious tradition that had great hopes and anticipation for the coming of the Messiah. In fact, the first 11 books of the Bible are often referred to as these prehistorical books, or chapters. The first 11 chapters of the Bible in the book of Genesis are often talked about as being prehistorical. But in the 12th chapter, we start picking up the history of the Jewish people. And it starts by God calling two people, Abraham and Sarah. God calls Abraham and Sarah and says that I am going to work through you and I am going to make a great nation. And of this great nation, you are going to be blessed, and you are called to be a blessing to all the families of the world. Well, the thing is this message came to Abraham and Sarah as they were elderly. They were very elderly. In fact, the scriptures say that Abraham was 99. Sarah was past that season when women were able to have children. As many of you know, one of my favorite passages that just brings a smile to my face comes out of the book of Hebrews, where in that book they described Abraham and Sarah as being so old they were as good as dead. And God had come to them and had promised them that God was going to work through them to make this great nation. And Abraham and Sarah were frustrated and they were disappointed. And they couldn't see it. And yet, God ended up working through that couple where they eventually had a child, even with all of the doubts that they had about God and about this vision that God had for them. They ended up having a child named Isaac. And Isaac ended up having a son named Jacob. And Jacob was just like Abraham and Sarah. I mean, he was a doubter. He doubted that God was going to work through things the way God had promised. And Jacob ended up entering into this wrestling match, and we're told that it's a wrestling match with God. And Jacob comes out of that wrestling match with a limp, but also a new name, because God renames Jacob Israel. And the word Israel means one who wrestles with God. And Jacob wrestled with God with all of his doubts, with all of his frustrations, and ended up understanding that it is okay because God is faithful and God will meet him in that. And yet Jacob also understood that he was still called to that work of being a blessing to all the families of the earth. Who's perhaps the best known doubter in the New Testament? Thomas, right? In fact, we always talk about doubting Thomas. You know, Jesus appeared in the upper room to the disciples. Thomas wasn't there. When Thomas comes back, they're like, Thomas, you wouldn't believe it. Jesus, he lives. He was here. Thomas says, yeah, right. If you think I'm going to believe that, unless I can see him with my own two eyes, unless I can touch the wounds in his heart, I don't believe it. And yet, Jesus did appear to Thomas. Thomas believed. And through Thomas, we understand that one of the things about doubt is if doubt raises questions And if questions lead to inquiry, and if inquiry leads to new discoveries, those doubts can be important catalysts for faith. But then, one of my very favorite things happens at the very end of Matthew's Gospel. At the very end of Matthew's Gospel, it's right when Jesus is giving his disciples their final instructions before he ascends into heaven. And I invite you to listen to this. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him. You know what the next line is? But some doubted. So they are on this mountain with Jesus. They worship him, and we're told that even the disciples who had worshipped him, who were present with him on that mountain, some of them doubted. And you know what Jesus ended up saying to them? Doubt all you want, but there is still a mission that you are called to complete. You are called, just like I did, to go to all people. You are called to teach them to love, just as I have taught you to love. You are called to baptize in my name, and you are called to continue this important work which Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and which all of the folks in this tradition which we found ourselves in understood their mission to be. And that even as people who doubt, we are called to get to work to make our world more caring and more loving and more just by being a blessing to all the families of the earth. You know, one of the things I really hope for my dad is that he understands that in his doubt, as one who does not believe in God, that in his doubt, he finds himself in a proud tradition of people who don't believe the way others believe, as people who have their doubts and their concerns, as a people who things don't make sense. And yet, as someone who was fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God as a beloved child, and even in doubt and even in disbelief, is called to a mission. And that is to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. The passage that Kelly read for us this day is one of those trigger passages for my dad. In fact, one of the things that I've heard this argument more than once, trust me, between my dad and my brother about the virgin birth. I have a brother who's a part of a confessional church. It's a conservative evangelical church. And an important part of what it means to be a part of that community is you confess to a shared set of beliefs that includes the virgin birth. And my brother just believes that my dad's salvation is dependent on him praying in a certain way and believing these things. These confessional things that his church teaches. Believing in the virgin birth. And my dad says, well, what you want me to do then is you just want me to reject science. You want me to reject things that we know to be true. And basically what you want me to do is just be stupid and believe. I don't think that's a real great way for my dad to frame it. But that's how he thinks of it, right? And this passage is one of those passages that really can set him off. And so I want to give you a way of, I'm hoping, a helpful way to think of what Kelly read for us this day. Now this passage starts out with a story that includes Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth is an older cousin of Mary. Elizabeth is married to Zechariah. Zechariah is a priest. Zechariah is a priest. They're part of this Jewish tradition. And if Elizabeth and Zechariah were like many families, right around the turn of some 2,000 years ago, if they followed many of the practices, probably soon after they were married, they would have wanted to have a child, and they would have started to have a child. I want you to use your imagination. Imagine wanting to have a child and working to have that child, desperately wanting to be parents. And there's all of this anticipation, and there's this hope, and then there's this disappointment, and this frustration, and this heartbreak, and then the cycle starts over again. And imagine that going for years and years and years, to the finally you find yourself in that place where you don't think it's going to happen. Whose story does the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah remind you of? Abraham and Sarah? You know, it's meant to. It is meant to point you back to the story of the Jewish people. The Jewish people who had received these prophecies about how they were going to be this great nation. They were going to be this great nation that had been blessed, but that was called to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And yet they found themselves living under foreign occupation. They found themselves struggling with their very existence. And they went through this stage of having these hopes and these dreams and anticipating, only to be disappointed and heartbroken and wondering if it will ever happen, until they find themselves in this really hard place. Well, Elizabeth and Zechariah ended up having a child, and that child was known to us as John the Baptist. But there's also the story of Mary. And there's the story of this young woman who the angel appears to her and says that she has conceived of a child. And Mary's like, how can that be? It's not even possible. I'm a virgin. And yet we know that child was conceived by the Holy Spirit. That's what the stories tell us. Now for many of us, including my dad, right away you go to this place where you dismiss those stories. We understand with our scientific minds, with everything we understand about how the world works and about biology, that those stories are not possible. In fact, we want to dismiss that culture as being this ancient, prehistoric culture that does not understand how the world works. And yet I wonder if that ancient culture didn't understand some things that we need to understand. So often, we go quickly to this place where we say things are impossible. So often we shut the door and we close that door on things, and we say that simply isn't possible. And I wonder if that isn't the point of the stories. The impossibility of those stories, I wonder if that is not exactly why those stories are part of our sacred tradition. Is to understand those things that we are quick to dismiss as impossible are possible with God. In fact, in the Scriptures, the prophet said that there was going to be a time when justice would roll down like the waters of a river. That where the lamb would lay down with the lion. Where those who are the most vulnerable in society and those who are dismissed as being last will be first. Where those who are broken-hearted in mourning will experience new life. Those stories are meant to help us understand that those things that we deem impossible, when we shut down in our minds and we think that they are simply not possible, they close our hearts and our minds to what it means to do the work and to be the people that participates in God's redemptive work in the world. You know, there are couples that are in loveless marriages, that need to believe that there is the possibility of love and new life. There are children that are lost and wounded and far from home that need to hear the grace that it is possible to come back home again and discover new life. There are people that find themselves in the throes of addiction who are sick and tired of being sick and tired and feel like there is no recovery and there's no new life, that need to understand that those things that we deem impossible are possible. Those stories invite us to that important work of understanding that those things that we shut the door on and we claim simply cannot happen are the things that limit our imagination and limit our engagement in the very work that God has called us to, of being a blessing to all the families of the earth. I don't know where you are in this Advent season. I don't know if you're filled with doubts. I don't know if you are feeling overwhelmed. I don't know if you're in this place of peace and contentment and meaning. But whatever the case may be, we come into this Advent season anticipating the coming of Christ anew in our lives, anticipating that coming when God's reign will rule here on earth, and there will be justice for all people. And we are come as this people that are called to believe the impossible, that we have been called to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. May we anticipate that call and that work with joy and hope. And may we never let our doubts get in the way of the mission that we've been called to. Amen.